Thank you very much, and I'm really thrilled to be here in Kolkata and to meet such a lovely group of people. Thank you to Mr. Neotia as patrons of this event. I think it's something every field needs patrons, and everything I've heard about your wonderful efforts and the things you do sound like you're a highly valued contributor to the culture of Kolkata and to India. And so, yeah, I'm very excited to share with you some of our work, but also it being a memorial lecture, some of the influences and developments that we've made that do relate directly to the work of Charles Correa. This image here is actually from the book in our office library. Unfortunately, I never got to meet Charles, but Mansam, my partner, was given this book by Charles Correa in, I think it's 89 or 87, when he visited Singapore. And in fact, I was meant to meet him a couple of years ago, and he cancelled the trip due to ill health, unfortunately, so I never got to meet him as I hoped to do. This book is one of the Mima books, and I think Charles Correa really, for me, graduating studying in the late 80s and graduating in late 80s, this collection of books, the Mima books, and the Mima magazine itself was something very influential on all of us. At that point, Kenneth Frampton had written the book on critical regionalism, which for architects who were in the 80s, I think it was a very influential book, and particularly in countries that were starting to look at their identity after independence. So a lot of the global shift from the colonies to be independent nations in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. All these topics were sort of pulled together in the critical regionalism movement. As I was looking at the book before I came, I was actually interested, because I hadn't looked at it, I have to say, for maybe 15 years or so, and in my head there was a little bit of blurring between Charles Correa, Jeffrey Bauer, Luis Barragan from Mexico. There was a lot of similarities between all these architects in the way they were exploring identity and modernism and dealing with climate and their historical, cultural references as well. So I was really shocked actually to see these couple of housing projects of his and how we had done projects that had obviously drawn very much on their sort of organizational strategies and geometric DNA. So this Tara housing project from very early in his career, using this idea of the terrace sort of strips of geometry and then adjusting the geometry to create something quite loose and organic, we used in our Gilstead Brooks cluster housing project. And in the next slide, also the Previ experimental housing project for Peru, I think. So you can see the plan from Charles Correa on the left and our plan on the right. It's exactly the same strategy. And you can see here a photograph of the model of that housing project and our built project in Singapore. Similarly, a view of the Tara group housing project and another view of our Gilstead Brooks cluster housing project. So it was around, I think, 30 years later, we were exploring very similar ideas. And some more views of it here. Similar, I think, this interest in kind of cubic modernist compositions, something very obvious in the images that Kamal was sharing with us about composing facades as something quite abstract, and using openings and profiles is something that we have explored a lot in our work too. Then again in plan, Charles Courier's project on the left, this very interesting sort of zippered interlocked plan. Any architect who's worked on sort of terrace housing projects realizes there's a kind of tyranny of the party wall where you can't seem to escape from it and you're stuck to the wall, and it makes you accelerate too quickly through the space. So this is a very smart plan of his which breaks that linearity of the wall and helps create a nice set of a sequence of stable spaces rather than this corridor-like feel. It's something that we came to a very similar solution in this terrace house project on the right-hand side. And here you can see a couple of photos of those that project and the sort of spaces that we had. Another really important influence of Charles Courier's work, I think, is the treatment of large architectural compound as more of a landscape. And I think you can see here in this Bharat Bhawan image, something that has very, very direct descendants in our work. And for instance, our Intercontinental project on the right, you can see exactly the same strategies of treating a roofscape as an abstract landscape. This is the plan of that hotel project, and again, I think this idea of a sort of ideal courtyard and a sense of playing with very pure geometries but making something informal within them is expressed very clearly in this project. There's another aspect of his work which I think is really interesting, which is this painterly aspect where walls are not only part of three-dimensional objects but sort of collapse into two-dimensional surfaces which you can then manipulate using paint and people's expectations of architecture to create this delightful shift between what's real and what's imagined or projected on the wall. And that's something that in our projects in a more abstract way, but we've been always using paint as a way of helping to change your perception of the reading of a form or architecture. The final project that I think is really super influential on us is the Kanchanjunga Apartments in Mumbai. And this one is always the project of his that I remember most clearly in my head, and I think has been something that we've drawn on very, very directly. And when I first came to Mumbai to work on our project there, and by chance saw the project in the city, I was really excited, like I'd seen a sort of movie star from in the city streets. And I think this idea that a high-rise building is not just an engineered object which is filled up with accommodation, but is something that can be quite a interesting spatial experience, is something that's really important, I think, in terms of a breakthrough. The high-rise form evolved in Chicago and in New York in very harsh climatic conditions, and has in a way always been led by engineers as something that was a technical problem to solve. How much can you solve circulation using lifts? How do you solve mechanical problems? How do you solve facade problems? And architects, to a great extent, were then brought into style this object in various fashionable ways. So I think this project showing that there's no need to abandon all the ideas we have about space, about creating sequences, about volumes. These don't have to be abandoned in a high-rise, and that there can be this interaction of inside and outside volumes has been something that we have been exploring with a lot of passion and excitement over the years. And this image from the book is something really that's in a way defined that vision for us for the last 25 years. Just an example is something from our work a few years ago, but here you can see that idea of the painted architecture. We had so many people ring us with this project. Oh, what did you use for the facade? And we were saying, oh, it's paint. Because people were just, at that point, I think everyone was using all kinds of metal cladding and things. We had no budget for it. But the idea that paint could transform simple cheap surface like plasterboard or a plastered wall into something you read quite different, I think also is directly from Charles Corrier. And you can see on a distant view of it on the right hand side, these gardens hanging in the air are a direct descendant of the Mumbai apartments. I'm now going to show 3 projects that we finished recently, which I think take these ideas in quite far. And I'll also show you just a few projects of our photos of our projects in Mumbai, because I think it's always very different working in every country. So I can share a little bit about the challenges and the opportunities that we see when we work in the Indian context. So first project I'm going to share is the Park Royal on Pickering, which we designed in 2007. So it's actually 10 years since we conceived of this building. And the page I'm showing you here is from our book, so I've brought a copy along to present to Mr. Nyotia after the talk. But for us it was an interesting book to do because we examined in terms of strategies across projects what we were doing, and we're very keen to share these strategies because we think in some ways it's very we think our ideas or our solutions could be important in solving some difficult problems that we're having in cities. So what we do in the book is as we introduce a project, we show the strategies and then also some ratios that we think are very important. I'll just talk about the ratios because I think we have limited time, but all our projects we've started evaluating under these ratios. So we have green plot ratio, community plot ratio, a civic generosity index, ecosystem contribution index, and a self-sufficiency index. And the reason we introduced these ratios or indices in our book is because we felt these were really important things that in some way need to balance the other ratios that we get put in front of us all the time, usually by developers or by city officials, things like net to gross ratio, surface area to volume ratio, because these ratios are actually economic ratios, which are a measure of a certain kind of efficiency. But often they're directly in opposition to the end user experience. And but the problem is because they're the only ratios talked about, they seem to gain their own kind of virtue, and people say, oh, my building's got these great ratios, it must be a great building, when actually it might be quite an unpleasant building, but a very cost-effective building. So green plot ratio is a simple measure of the area of greenery as a comparison to the area of the site. And where we're quite excited in our projects is we're starting to get quite huge ratios here. So in this case we have 240% green plot ratio, which means we have almost 2.5 times as much garden as if we didn't build the building at all and left the site empty.